If you can't control yourself, someone else will. That is a quote by Friedrich Nietzsche. It comes from his book Twilight of the Idols. And it's part of a bigger paragraph which says, "He who cannot obey himself will be obedient." For every creature that has not attained to individuality, to self-mastery, has been created for the purpose of being an instrument for the ends of another. So this quote has caused quite a bit of confusion and even controversy. People have used it to justify anything from a lack of self-discipline to straight-up evil behavior, because the quote sounds so absolute. But what does this actually mean? Let's break it down. When we look at this quote in its full context, it becomes much clearer what Nietzsche is driving at. He doesn't mean that if you can't control yourself, like if you can't stop eating dessert, then someone else, like your mum, will control you. Or if you can't control your impulses at work, your boss will end up controlling you. Although that could certainly be true in some cases, that's not what this quote is about. Instead, Nietzsche uses much bigger examples of losing control. He talks about losing control of your life, your soul, or even your morality. And in order to understand what he means by that, we first have to take a look at his concept of the Übermensch. In German, it's called der Übermensch. But Übermensch doesn't translate directly into English. The most common translation is Übermensch, which is where we get the word Superman from. But this is misleading because when Nietzsche coined this term, Superman wasn't yet a common figure in fiction. Superman was only created 20 years later in 1938 by Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. Nietzsche didn't have any fictional characters in mind when he came up with this term. Rather, he used the word Mensch, which in German can also mean human. So an Übermensch can literally be translated as an overhuman. However, the more accurate translation would be something like a higher human, a superhuman or a superior human. The idea of the Übermensch is central to all of Nietzsche's philosophy. He believed that humans are currently in a state of becoming, a constant process of evolving and developing. And in this process, not all humans develop equally. Some of them remain weak and inferior. They stay dependent on others and never really become independent thinkers. Others, however, develop beyond the current state of humanity. They break free of the conventional morality of their time and forge their own path through life. These individuals are what Nietzsche calls Übermensch, or overhumans. Nietzsche believed that the main goal of life should be to strive for this state of Übermensch. He thought that every person should try to overcome the current limitations of mankind and reach a higher level of existence. Of course, this doesn't mean that Nietzsche thought that we should rule over other people like some kind of master race. Instead, it's more about each individual trying to reach their highest potential. But what does any of this have to do with our quote? Well, let's take a look at another one of Nietzsche's quotes. "He who has a why can endure any how." This is much easier to understand. If you have a strong enough reason for doing something, you won't mind the difficulties that come with it. For example, if you want to become a world-class pianist, you will endure the many hours of practicing that it takes to get there. Or if you want to get into great physical shape, you will endure the pain of working out and dieting. Now let's replace the word why with the word control. The sentence still makes sense. If you have control, you won't mind any how. This is where the quote, "If you can't control yourself, someone else will," fits in. Nietzsche says that the only way to have control over yourself is by having a strong enough will. If your will isn't strong enough, others can impose their will onto you and control you. This is actually very similar to the theory of the greatest good. It's a utilitarian concept that says that actions are right in proportion to the amount of happiness or pleasure they produce, and wrong as they produce suffering. So according to this theory, if you voluntarily choose to do something that causes more suffering than happiness, well then, it's not the best choice. You should instead choose the action that leads to the greatest amount of overall happiness. But how do you know which action will cause the most happiness? You need a guiding principle. You need control. And this is exactly what Nietzsche is getting at. He says that if you don't have control over yourself, if you aren't able to set your own guiding principles, then you will follow the principles of others. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. Let's say that you are an apprentice at a job and your boss tells you to do something that you think is morally wrong. What will you do? Hopefully you will stand up for what you think is right and quit your job. But let's say that you have bills to pay and a family to feed. You might not be able to quit your job. In this case, you have no choice but to follow the principles of your boss. Even though you might not agree with them, you are controlled by your economic situation. You don't have control over your boss either. Otherwise, you wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. Nietzsche knew that we can't always have control over everything, but he believed that we should always try to have as much control over ourselves as possible. Why? Because according to him, this is the only way to achieve happiness and meaning in life. Nietzsche says that the pursuit of meaning is the primary motivation behind all human actions. All of us want to feel that our lives have some kind of meaning. We all want to feel that our actions are driven by something greater than ourselves. But this is only possible if we are in control. If we don't have control over ourselves, we will look for meaning in external sources. And this is what Nietzsche calls the will to power. In his book, The Will to Power, Nietzsche writes that the origin of all things is a will. Everything in the universe strives for power. But the form this striving takes depends on the strength of the will. A weak will tries to gain power by dominating others. A stronger will, on the other hand, seeks to master itself. And the strongest will of all is the will of the Übermensch. They don't dominate others or seek to be dominated by others. They simply strive to grow and develop as individuals. In fact, Nietzsche believed that the main difference between the Übermensch and the average person is the degree of self-control they have. The Übermensch has complete control over themselves. They don't allow others to dictate how they should live their lives. They also don't allow themselves to be controlled by their emotions. On the contrary, the average person lacks self-control. They are easily manipulated by their feelings. They give in to their darkest impulses. And since they can't control themselves, they allow others to control them. But why should we strive for self-control? What's in it for us? According to Nietzsche, the answer is simple. Self-control is the key to happiness. If we can't control our actions, if we are constantly giving in to our darkest desires, we will never be truly happy. Why? Because happiness is a state of mind. It's a feeling of satisfaction and contentment with our lives. And we can only feel satisfied if we know that we are in control. Let's go back to the example of the apprentice who has to choose between his morals and his job. Let's say he gives in and does what his boss asks him to do. Sure, he keeps his job and can continue to make money, but at what cost? He has compromised his morals. He has chosen to do something he believes is wrong. As a result, he might experience feelings of guilt and shame. And these feelings can easily destroy his happiness, even if he keeps his job and continues to make money. On the other hand, let's say he stands up for his beliefs and quits his job. Sure, he loses his source of income, but at least he can still be happy. He can still feel satisfied with himself because he knows that he did the right thing. Nietzsche believed that this is the kind of thinking that leads to happiness and meaning. He believed that the only way to achieve these things is by taking control of our lives. So what should you do if you find yourself in a situation where you can't control yourself? Well, according to Nietzsche, the answer is simple. You need to get your act together. You need to start taking responsibility for your actions and start making better choices. It won't be easy, but as Nietzsche said, he who has a why can endure anyhow. If you want to be happy, if you want to lead a meaningful life, you need to take control of your life. You need to become the master of yourself rather than the slave. Have you ever felt like you were out of control? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Also, if you found this video interesting, consider checking out this playlist on the side. It has a bunch of videos about philosophy and psychology. And of course, if you want to stay up to date, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.